and welcome back to Around Our World in 80. I'm flying solo for the next couple of vlogs. The two things that we're going to be sharing over the next couple weeks, they haven't really involved the whole family. Today's is just Jared and I, and the other one for next week is just me. So you're just going to get me for the next few minutes. But I'm really excited about today's vlog. As many of you guys have seen on previous vlogs, I've talked about Redeemed. Redeemed is a nonprofit that works with human trafficking victims, and I had the utmost honor to get to work with them over the course of several years. Unfortunately, it didn't work out where I was able to continue working with them. They were going in a different direction, but the subject of human trafficking is something that resonates with me more than probably any other human crisis, so to speak, that we have on the planet today. There's just something about the idea that somebody can dehumanize somebody else and treat them in just horrendous ways. I have a hard time fathoming it. I don't understand why people treat others that way, and why we just can't value life as a society. But I have been very lost on what my role in fighting human trafficking is since I have been let go from Redeemed. And so when I heard that Mercury Studios and the Mercury One charity was putting on a pop-up museum at Mercury Studios, I was very excited. I didn't really know what to expect. I knew that it was going to talk about slavery, and the Emancipation Proclamation was going to be on display, and that sold me right off the bat. But what I ended up getting was so much more, and I just really wanted to share it with you guys. So when we arrived, we went through, security and stuff like that, and they actually had a video and a banner that presented you with questions, and these were kind of the talking points of the entire museum. Just really wondering, is slavery a problem today? Was slavery racist back in the historical time period, the 1800s and before that? And so it was kind of nice to get an idea of what kind of questions we were going to be answering while visiting the museum. When you go in, they had a couple of banners that were like kind of comparing and contrasting slavery back in historical period versus slavery now. What I found really interesting was they actually had a worldwide map of slavery in the 1800s, or basically whenever slavery was happening around the world and the slave trade was active. Most slaves actually went to Europe and to Brazil. I think Brazil was almost 50% of all slaves from Africa ended up in Brazil. And the United States was only at 2.3% of slaves were brought from Africa over to the United States. So it was a slim chance that if you were a slave, you were actually coming to America. And then on the bottom there, they had a map showing where slavery is today, and most of it's actually in Africa and the Middle East, which I found incredible. And then on the other side of the area, there was how they transported slaves during the slave trade. They had, I think a lot of us have seen in textbooks the picture of how slaves were put in a boat, just stacked on top of each other. But then they also showed a picture of stick figures in a semi. Because that's how most slaves are transported today. And it was very interesting, the imaging that they used, because it just shows how they just stack people together and treat them so inhumanely. And you could be driving down the highway and not even know that it would be a semi full of people. Then we went into a simulation environment of what a slave boat would be like, and they went for all five senses. It was dark. They had one light in the top where the ladder went up to, and they had the bunks where people would just be stacked like sardines. They did say they romanticized it a little bit because they had the candles in there so that people could see and they won't trip. But they also had the smell and the sounds, and I was having a hard time with the smell, but I wasn't having as hard of a time with it as some other people. They did a really good job of really simulating that. And so when we went through there, they talked about the experience of coming over from Africa to another country in the slave trade, what conditions were like. And then they went into the actual like museum part where they talked about slave owners, they talked about the slaves, they talked about bondages, I think that's how that works, and just what was the foundation of slave masters, what was the foundation of the slave trade. And what was really interesting was they actually had an original draft of the Declaration of Independence on display. And it was really interesting. The founding fathers, when they got together to declare independence from Great Britain, they said that no matter what happens, anything we write in this document, we have to be unanimous on, because if we aren't, then King George is going to use it against us and is going to use it to split us up, and we will not win our independence. And so the original draft actually had a whole paragraph. It was almost longer than all the other paragraphs, talking about the injustice of King George and his support of slavery. It's a paragraph within a bunch of paragraphs just talking about all the things that we had a problem with that King George was doing. When we know the ones about taxation and no representation and stuff like that, but I had never seen this paragraph because it didn't end up making it into the final draft. It was basically saying that one of the reasons they wanted to split off from England was because King George supported the slave trade, and 3 colonies had actually abolished slavery, and King George had vetoed the colonial laws. And the reason why it didn't make it into the original Declaration of Independence was because both of the Carolinas and Georgia actually still supported slavery. And so because they had all agreed it had to be unanimous, it was struck from the final document. But everybody talks about how, the founding fathers didn't do anything to stop slavery, or that they even were just kind of passive about it, but they were actively trying to stop it. But they knew that if they were going to take a stand right there, we would never have gotten our independence from Great Britain, and with a king that supported slavery would never stop slavery. So this was a necessary stepping stone to eventually get to the Civil War, which is where the museum goes. As you go through the museum, they have some really interesting augmented reality aspects to their app, so you can actually interact with a lot of the different exhibits. They had the Emancipation Proclamation on display, as I already mentioned. They had a draft of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. They had an original Juneteenth message, which is the day that news saying slavery doesn't exist in America anymore arrived in Texas. It was all of these amazing things, just talking about the pivotal moments to change the tide and opinion on slavery in America. They had original documents, including like an original copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, lots of different things like that. They told stories about different historical and modern abolitionists, and that was one thing I really appreciated, was they compared and contrasted historical abolitionists and present-day abolitionists throughout the entire museum. They had several things of Abe Lincoln on display, the family Bible, a piece of the collar that he was actually wearing when he was assassinated. It was honestly just mind-blowing, the amount of stuff that they had, just telling the story of how America decided we were going to not tolerate slavery anymore. One of the augmented reality things was also a picture of Lincoln accepting the presidency, and Booth, John Wilkes Booth, is actually in the crowd, and it's the only known picture with both of them in the same picture, which was really interesting. After that, they actually progressed with time linear. I'm having a hard time pronouncing things today. Linearly, chronologically, and they then talked about the KKK era, and they talked about lynchings and how lynchings weren't just black, they were mostly black, but they also lynched white people that supported black equality, and they would make it a very public scene, and they would have picnics on the grounds of the lynchings, and they compared and contrasted a lot of time with the ISIS videos that they published on YouTube and things like that. And just how they would mask themselves very similarly to the KKK, and really delved into why the KKK did some of the things that they did, just because they did not want to tolerate blacks as an equal human being. And their main focus was to use intimidation and to not allow any positive stories about blacks to go public. Following that, there was actually a whole section just talking about presidents that helped equal rights and presidents that didn't. The one that struck me the most was Woodrow Wilson. I knew he was not the best president in the first place. He really set us up for the eventual Great Depression. But he also did a number of almost like historical wipes where he didn't want any story or any textbook to have a positive view of black people. And he, under his presidency, the KKK was actually revived. It's just really tragic to me to see somebody in our leadership do stuff like that, and we still, for some reason, a lot of people still think he's a great president. And it's just sad to me, to be very honest. One of the ones I was also surprised about in a positive way was Theodore Roosevelt, who I haven't necessarily I've had more of a neutral opinion about him, but he did invite the first black man and his family to come eat at the White House. That was a first in his presidency, and I was pleasantly surprised to find out about him. So it was just really cool to to see the historical background and who was for equal rights and who wasn't. And then again, chronologically going, they went to the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. One of the things that was actually really interesting was they had it was the page of all of the people that won gold medals in the Olympics when it was held in Berlin in the 30s when Hitler was in power, and Jesse Owens' signature is on it, and he was, obviously one of the first black athletes to really succeed and make his mark on the Olympics. And for somebody like Hitler, who absolutely despised anybody who wasn't of Aryan race, it was really interesting to see that his name did end up on something that was delivered to Hitler. But yeah, they just had so much memorabilia and like poll taxes and such crazy stuff that was going on in the civil rights movement, and just kind of told the story of how people just stood up and said this isn't going to happen anymore. One of my favorite movies these days is Hidden Figures, because we're like right on the cusp of the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, so I've been watching space movies all the time. But I love Hidden Figures. I love everything that it talks about with equal rights. And yeah, it's just really this particular section of the museum reminded me of things that you see in movies like Hidden Figures. And I'm just really glad we live in a country where we have such brave people and say this isn't right, and we're gonna do what we can to make the world a better place. The last area of the museum was actually a very narrow hallway, and it was kind of like the conclusion paragraph. So it compared and contrasted human slavery in history and human slavery now, and they found really amazing pictures to put right next to each other, talking about transportation, talking about who's affected, talking about all sorts of things. It was very, very moving to walk through that hallway and to see those pictures and to say, we get on to people back then for what they did or did not do while there was slavery, and yet we have slavery here today. And what are we doing? What are people going to say about us in history in textbooks when they see how many slaves that we have today, and we seem to be doing nothing about it. And so what is our role to help this injustice? And they finished the museum with a white area that had these giant banners, and it had abolitionists from history and people that made it out of slavery and their accomplishments, and then people from today that have made it out of slavery and have been brought out of specifically a lot of the Middle East and things that they're doing today and their accomplishments and how they're fighting human trafficking and slavery. And so I thought it was awesome. I thought it was absolutely amazing. If you hear my family in the background, they just got back from a walk. Total side note, so this is in the Mercury Studios, which is where Blaze TV broadcasts from. One of the people on Blaze TV is Glenn Beck, and he has his office in there, and he's a huge Disney memorabilia collector. And so I'm like standing there, there's the Emancipation Proclamation. Oh, and there's my dog. And right behind it is like one of the original bust costumes of Darth Vader. So I was like freaking out about the Emancipation Proclamation, and then subsequently freaking out about Darth Vader, among other things. One of the cool things at the very end was one of the original Disneyland park benches that I got to sit on. There was one of the original script copies of The Seven Dwarfs, one of the original parts of the script from Star Wars: A New Hope. The actual like book that they used to open at the beginning of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was there. So it was just really, really cool. A lot of the Disney stuff I got to see, so this Disney nerd was freaking out. But yeah, it was really amazing. Obviously it was a pop-up museum, so it was only 2 weeks long. And I was really swamped with traveling, so I was not able to get this out in time. So you can't go visit anymore. But I hope that as you guys are watching this and as you guys are seeing some of the video and pictures that I was able to take while visiting, it gives you guys an idea of, it gives you guys understanding that slavery is still an issue today. It does not look like it did in history, but it still exists. And I hope you guys pray about what is your role. Is your role to financially give? Is your role to pray? Is your role to give of your time, so that we can effectively help these people not only get out of slavery, but also thrive in liberty. So if you guys are interested, reach out to me. I know some great organizations that are doing some great work, and hopefully we'll be able to fight slavery together. Y'all have a great week, and I will talk to y'all next week. Bye!